Tracy Harwood. So I've done a little bit of digging around and I've discovered
Ricky Grove. Fog comes in on little cat feet.
Phil Rice. This is the best film that I've seen all year and maybe ever.
Damien Valentine. Use the machinima, Luke. Hello, welcome to another installment of And Now for Something Completely Machinima. I'm Damien Valentine. Happy holidays. And I'm joined by Tracy Harwood, Ricky Grove,
Hello.
and Phil Rice.
Hey there.
So yeah, this week we're going to be talking about Tracy's film. But do you have any news for us as well?
Well, actually, I've got a question, more than news, and actually the question is for Ricky, because I was really interested to see that SAG AFTRA had kind of settled its dispute with studios, and I guess the question I'd got for you, Ricky, is: does that mean you'll now get paid for the use of your characters, including the ones that have been repurposed from previously?
Yes, but the amount will be minimal for me.
Right.
Because except for maybe one film, Army of Darkness, because I was a lead in that one. Well, now let me think a second. They're not doing percentages like residuals. They're doing something they call bonuses. Yeah, I'll probably be getting some from it. I think they had to compromise in the final analysis. There was an interview with a guy who was on the negotiating team, and he said they had got everything else taken care of except for the streaming issues, and they even got the AI squared away. But the studios absolutely refused to give a percentage of any very successful streaming service. They absolutely refused. So the negotiating committee had to go back and rethink what they were doing, and they came up with this idea of a bonus, which is a compromise. I think they should have stayed to their guns and forced them to do a percentage. But then again, everybody's hurting when you have a long time strike. So I think they were thinking about that as well. But it turned out that successful show, everybody who's on any streaming platform, once you hit a certain threshold of money, is entitled to a certain level of bonus. The most successful programs are the ones that are going to get the reasonable bonuses. That's unlike residuals, in which residuals are based on a percentage thing. For example, even today, after 20 some odd years of doing Army of Darkness, I still get $200 to $500 checks based on that. So that's a good deal for me versus residuals. However, it was a bonus situation. I don't think that money's going to be as high. The Screen Actors Guild claims it's going to result in over $1 billion of extra income. I wonder about that. I'm not sure. I think maybe their calculations, based on their calculations, they believe that, but I'm not so sure that's going to be it's going to be high, but it's not going to be that high, I don't think. But anyway, they compromised in order to come up with something that's acceptable. They got something in return, which is the best way to do a negotiation like that. They had leverage. The producers had leverage. They worked it out and got it taken care of and stopped the strike. So I think it's okay. I think it's good. So the answer to your questions, yes, I'll be getting a minuscule amount of money for successful streaming on Netflix.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Sure. I wanted to find that out after I heard that your character was just taken and included in a game, and then you got nothing for it. So it is really interesting to hear you say that you will get something from it. And
they did get strong safeguards against use of actors' images with AI, and that was big deal for them. So that was probably their biggest achievement in the
Yes,
negotiation.
indeed, indeed. So guess I've got no more news. So I was going to sort of kind of segue from Army of Darkness into my picks, actually.
Okay.
Okay.
If you're happy for me to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I this month have picked 2 films, and both of them are cinematic battle scenes. One is filmed in Unreal Engine, and the other is in Warhammer. And the first one I found was actually the Warhammer film. So let me start with that, and then I'll go into the other one, and then I've got a question for you all to think about. So bear with me where I go with this. So the first film is called Northern Wars. It's a Total War Warhammer 2 cinematic battle machinima by Game Thumb, released 3 or 4 years ago now. And it's actually a music video, which was the aspect of it that really caught my attention, first of all, because at first I thought it was that kind of guttural throat singing. I don't know if you've ever heard of the heavy metal Tibetan band called Who, which they do this kind of really guttural kind of
Tuvan, I think it's called.
I think they're Mongol.
Mongol, are they? Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
that style
But
of
that
singing,
region of the world, yeah.
well, that just kind of fascinated me. I've sort of followed it a little bit for the last sort of couple of years, because I just never really heard anything quite like that. And I thought this was going to be in that kind of vein, and it kind of is, but actually it's not at all. It's set to Berserker by a project called Danheim, which is a Nordic folk and Viking inspired company project, what he calls a project, which is based in Copenhagen. And it's worth saying that Danheim is inspired by ideas and stories from the darker side of the Viking period, consisting of kind of Nordic mythology, old Danish folklore, and what he describes as a vivid imagination. And it's been used in TV shows like The Vikings and Vikings Valhalla. The subject, the Berserker, were Norse warriors who apparently fought in a trance-like state, which is where we get the word berserk from. And you often see these guys wearing things like bear skins and wolf skins and all that kind of thing. But I'm guessing, Ricky, probably you can tell us a little bit more about this type of mythology, having played Duke Henry the Red in Army of Darkness. But before we get into that, let me tell you about the machinima. It's a really bloody battlefield cinematic with these kind of 2 opposing factions in full cry from Warhammer, and basically this guy sort of edits the footage to this music. I think he's done it pretty well, actually. It's been created using a bunch of mods to capture the scene. These kind of guttural sounds that you hear, they are both from the music and also from the ogres and the creatures like the mammoths and the dragons and the wolf and the bearskin warriors in the game. There's some really good timing, I think, with the editing. The timing of the action and the slow motion shots, I think, are really quite a highlight here. There's clearly a winning side at the end of it, although I don't think I really care what that is by the end of it. It's what I would say is utterly gruesome. It's brutal, but it's also kind of mythical, and I think captures pretty well what that music portrays. I listened to the music also without the animation. I tended to feel overall that this film added a layer to it, and I like the detail in the characters on which the creator had kind of focused. So, for example, the kind of lumbering way the characters move and the facial expressions and such, which I think partly justified, or was his attempt to partly justify, some of the guttural sounds in Danheim's music. So I'll move straight on to the second one, and then you'll see where I'm going with it. The second film is a similar-ish kind of proposition, which is described as a medieval fantasy made in Unreal Engine 5. It's called Oryctes.
Erectus.
Oryctes, yeah.
Oryctes, I think.
Oryctes, something like that. By Glow Production. It's a battle scene again, this time between just two characters, a dragon and a knight or a warrior. And once again, you kind of catch the scene midway through. It's kind of an epic battle. There's magic and myths involved and some kind of gory action. I think the dragon is actually named Oryctes because of its rhinoceros-like fighting horn. Although when I looked that up, it's actually really quite disappointing to discover it's the name of a rhinoceros beetle rather than a mammoth-like creature.
Oh, yeah, very different. It was a tiny little beetle that the guy was fighting.
Exactly. Well, maybe it was. I don't. Maybe there's a scaling thing. I don't know. The soundscape, though, is lots of grunting and clashing of weaponry. There's really no music in this at all. And there's not much story to it either, although there's a surprising kind of transformation at the end.
Oh, I got to debate you on that.
Yeah. When what caught my attention with this one and what intrigued me about this one is actually the interesting camera work that followed the fight. And I kind of watched this a few times, and it made me jump nearly every single time I watched it when that dragon came into shot in the beginning. And then, then you kind of followed that action with it skidding across the ground as the warrior kind of gets thrown about. I thought that was the most fascinating bit of it. I guess you won't be surprised to know that the creators of this are actually professional CG they're the professional CG production company. They're also one of the very few that's based in Malaysia. And I think that partially explains what I'd really call the mishmash of cultural references in this particular film, which is what troubled me about it. And whilst I love the detail of the editing, just like I did when we talked about the Alchemist's confession one, I really loved the detail in that. You guys were absolutely bang on when you were critiquing it. But in this one, I think the assets, to me, just didn't gel with the story arc somehow. And that goes from everything from the, what's it called, Oryctes, name for the dragon, a knight rather than a warrior, a werewolf, some ancient woodland, and right at the beginning, an Asian carving on the rock. Somehow they just clashed, somehow. And I guess at some level you might call these kind of anachronisms. But then again, maybe that was the whole point of this. That's maybe perhaps why these guys put these things together, to kind of create the tension between these kind of things, to create this. But what I wanted to do with you guys here, and why I wanted to discuss these particular films, was so that we could further explore some of the things that we talked about during the November's podcast episodes. You'll recall in several episodes, we talked about writing for the characters. But here, what I think we're focusing on is the issue of writing for the cinematics. And I thought these two films would probably be a good way to discuss it. You might well disagree, but I thought they were kind of a good way to sort of get into that, because there are both similarities and differences between them. And obviously one is machinima. It's made in a game with mods. And the other is more of what I'd call probably a virtual production using Unreal Engine, probably with assets from the marketplace, and almost certainly made using mocap for character movement. But maybe we can ignore some of that side of it for now. I think for me, what this kind of comparison exposes is that there needs to be clarity in choices, in the choices that are made, which are consistent with whatever it is you are trying to portray. And I think it's the mood sense, let's say, in both of these films. In the first one, I would say I got a clearer sense of the continuity between the choices the creators have made. I mean, the scenes are, I suppose, bloody as they are kind of justified in the context of that music and the backstory to that music. So it's not I don't think it's just because it's a game and everything is probably already in the game. But the choices he made in putting that together, I think, are creating that mood scene. It's a kind of what would you call it? A vignette, perhaps. In Oryctes, I kind of felt that it should have been as compelling as the other one, and whilst technically it is pretty well done, I think it just kind of lacks that clarity in the achievement of the mood state for me. So I thought, here's my analysis of it. Here's two films that are broadly similar, but I'd really like to see what you guys make of these and whether or not you can add to that discussion or whether you disagree with me completely.
Well, I think you've done a marvelous job of arranging several balls of reasoning onto a pyramid, and I'm really sorry to have to smash that pyramid down.
Great, go on.
I have the exact opposite reaction to you. In Oryctes, I found the story to be compelling. It had a clear beginning, middle, and an end. The characters were empathetic. Whereas in Northern Wars, the Warhammer one, it's the kind of battle that is so unrealistic, you'd only find it inside of a game. You know, you've got groups of people grouped together so closely at times that there's no way they could actually fight. They would be encumbering each other. And although it was bloody, it seemed to be more spectacle than actually real characters that you could empathize. I could immediately identify with the situation in Oryctes. And although you're right to point out those details that were discontinuous, none of that mattered because I was focused on what was occurring, the action of it. It was so well edited and the pace was just right. And then you had a little twist ending. I don't want to ruin it for people, but the twist ending was really nice. If you broke it down to, if each movie represented a game and they were advertising that game, I would play Oryctes, but I wouldn't play Northern Wars. And that's it.
Thank you.
I liked them both, though, I have to say. I enjoyed watching them, and I thought they were fascinating picks. And the discussion of the difference between the cutscene and a film, I think, is a really rewarding conversation.
Phil?
Yeah, I'm debating about which one to start with. I guess it doesn't really matter. I'll start with Northern Wars. You know, since the dawn of the modern special effects era, when we've gotten to, and I think specifically of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movie, you know, these are novels that I grew up with, and it was all down to my imagination of what does a troll look like? What does a cave troll look like? And it was just magical to see these really otherworldly, strange creatures, even orcs, but the big ones in particular. Just gives me goosebumps. The thing that was disappointing about what was, I believe, our first major encounter with a troll using the modern technology in Peter Jackson's movie was it was in a cave, and like the color palette of that was gray to slightly darker gray. Like it was just so bland. And I realized that's just the nature of where they were. This is like all the vivid color that I would have hoped for, that I imagined. What does a troll look like? And woolly mammoths. I grew up learning about saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths. They were particularly interesting because we were very confident that they roamed North America. Dinosaurs, you know, they're all over, but those seem like they're, you know, they were talked about like, yeah, this could have happened right here, you know, woolly mammoths in particular. I know I'm rambling here a bit, but the point is that for me, the very first thing that gripped me about this Northern Wars was seeing those big creatures in all this vivid color. It's a neat looking aesthetic. You're right. There's not really they weren't really even endeavoring towards story here, so I feel weird. I don't feel right criticizing it for lack of story, because that clearly wasn't the intent here. There wasn't really a narrative. I think, Ricky, you used the word spectacle, and I think that's what this was, and it's pretty neat looking. It's very, very clearly video gamey. You know, some of the way that the action plays out, it's unrealistic. It's stylized, I guess. And yeah, there's parts of it that don't quite make cohesive sense. Some of the behaviors in the battle and these larger than life, you know, sweeps of, you know, huge and guys flying all over. It reminds me a lot of the tech that Peter Jackson used in those Lord of the Rings movies for the large scale battles. A boulder goes crashing in and you just see all these, you know, it's just little figures getting smashed. I mean, it's such large scale, it's hard to take in. And this feels like it's aiming more towards that than it is towards anything resembling a realistic battle. But I enjoyed it, and I guess I found myself enchanted by it because of the way that those larger creatures were portrayed. So it's a very personal reaction. You know, and it's not a game that I would go out of my way for, but I'm very, very picky. But it is, I mean, it is neat looking. I've played some of the early Warhammer games on a PlayStation 1. It's come along a little bit since then. This is yeah, graphically a little bit superior.
Yeah.
It is a Tarantino level of bloodletting. Like it's just comical almost.
Yeah, how many times did they show that goddamn troll chomping down on some person? Come on.
Yeah. So and frankly, that I think that means that this game, you know, has that element to it. You know, it's a little frightening that you know, people like, you know, the game players like my kids' age are probably so desensitized to gore and violence that they won't be put off by that. When I step back and think about that, that's a little frightening.
Yeah.
That's become,
it's always been that way, though.
I mean, frankly, when I was their age, if I saw something like this, I'd be running for a bucket, you know. And now it's just like, that's more of that than I prefer. What? So yeah. Anyway, yeah, it was pretty over the top in that regard. But I'm glad. I mean, I don't know that this would have ever ended up in my feed from the algorithm, and I'm glad that I got to watch it. There's stuff to be admired in it. And it's relatively well edited, and I loved the music. Like
that's true. The music was excellent.
The music was extraordinary. I love that kind of thing too. I've followed that the Who as well. Was really neat to see that kind of when they had their moment and kind of came to the public eye. I followed them after that point too. It was pretty neat. And yeah, that guttural singing, which is, there's different parts of the world where that's worked its way into things, Vikings being one. That's fascinating stuff. So, all right. So Oryctes or Oryctes. I don't know which way is the right way to pronounce it, but so I think that I suspect that some of Ricky's extra level of affinity for this is the Elden Ring effect. You know, I mean, that game has really taken hold of him. And so, and there's many games that preceded that in that line of kind of the swords and sorcery games that I haven't really had much personal involvement with. So I can't say that the story immediately engaged me, but it didn't take long. And I think I think that's completely owed to the craft of it. I do think this was very well crafted. It was not at all, like Ricky emphasized, it was not hard to understand, to get my bearings. like just seconds into the film, okay, so I don't know who this is or how he stumbled upon this creature or why he's got a quest. I don't care either. Like, it doesn't matter. I know what's going on here. It's the story is archetypal, I think. Is that the way you pronounce that word? Archetypal? It's an
Archetypal.
Yeah, archetypal story of King George and the St. George and the, I don't know, I'm messing it up, but it's this element of a who I think we can presume is a hero facing this larger than life opponent, and trying to prevail, trying to survive, but and also prevail in it. And then, yeah, I wish we could talk about the twist. I hate that we can't, because it's very important. It actually determines which archetypal story we're looking at here.
Indeed,
and it's not just slay the dragon. It's not just that story. That twist actually recontextualizes what we've just seen happen, and I love it. And it's not because I haven't seen it before. It's been done many times. But I think that's okay. I think that archetypal stories are told and retold for a reason. I think they stick with us over millennia for a reason.
Well, it's not just the archetypal, it's also the high fantasy tradition. It ties itself into that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's and as far as the craft of this, I mean, come on. This is one of the best crafted things that's ever been on our desk for this show. I mean, it's almost flawless in that regard. And they're professionals. So okay, but I mean, it's exquisitely made. So now I'm just down to, what do I take away from it? Because seeing it extremely well made is neat in the moment, and that's great. And I want to learn something from it, perhaps, and rewatch, and oh wow, the way that they handled this, or the way they lit this particular scene, or the shot selection. There's all kinds of stuff you could dissect and learn from this. But ultimately, what am I going to take away from it? It's what was underneath that story. And yeah, it's there. It's there. I think there's reasons why it will be more compelling to some than to others, as like with the thing I mentioned about the Elden Ring effect with Ricky. I think my son would absolutely devour this, because he really loves Elden Ring, even more so than the game. He loves kind of
the story,
opening up the unfolding what the world building was behind that game. Like, in the same way that I think somebody who read a Game of Thrones, or who read Tolkien's works, not saw the movies, actually read it, because that's where the world building is in the actual novels. I feel like that Elden Ring is a novel. I mean, it has the same effect on,
it's funny, George Martin was a contributor to the story.
Yeah, and it shows. So when you're entering into this film, remember we talked a few weeks back about Ludwig Wittgenstein. I brought him up about his notion that you bring something to a text. A text isn't a static thing necessarily. It's about interplay between the reader and the text.
Yeah.
So you bring context to the text. And I think that this film is ripe for that. That if you're coming to it with a context of world building, then it nestles in place like a jigsaw piece. I mean, this fits into that world instantly. So that may be why it didn't instantly resonate with you, Tracy, because I get the impression you're not playing Elden Ring on a regular basis.
No, I don't think she is.
Right. So
she should.
But it's just an extraordinary pick. I feel like I need more watches of it to see if there is any more detail of that story to extract from it. And it's challenging, because to address your point about writing, yeah, there's no dialogue, right? And I don't think there's a single word of dialogue in either one of these, are there?
That's correct.
But
yeah.
and frankly, I don't think there's more than 2 sentences of writing behind Northern Wars. I don't mean as an insult. It's just a battle. This is one of those things that, like, on a screenplay, there would be like a couple sentences,
Right, and that would be
but
it,
then it
the
ends
whole
up
film.
being a 15-minute scene, right?
Yeah.
So, well, with Oryctes, there's writing that happened here. It's just not dialogue. That's all. But it's absolutely, even if it was never committed to paper, it's written. It's that there is writing structure going on here, and it's very effectively done as a, what is essentially a silent film. A film that tells its story through nonverbal, through the action, through facial expression. And those are tools, and to some degree, it's advantageous to not have anything spoken, because this film is 100% international.
Yeah.
It is universally understandable.
Yeah.
Because of that. There's no, and okay, they messed up some of the symbology and did some anachronisms and stuff there, or cultural anachronisms, which I did not catch, because I'm not nearly as educated on that as you are. I believe that they're there, but it didn't strike me. And yeah, it is curious, like how that would come to be. Is it carelessness? Is it deliberate? It's hard to know.
Yeah.
But even if you stripped those things out of this film, those specifics, this has a universal, if not appeal, a universal understandability.
Yeah.
And some of that is because it is an archetypal story of a kind, and some of it too is just they told the story using other terms. It's writing that isn't about the words so much, if that makes sense. Yep. So great picks. I'm really glad. Yep. Really glad you shared these with us. I really
can I make a quick comment on story before we move on to Damien? One interesting thing is that the Oryctes had a title card with a description of what the world is. It says dragons have taken over the world. Humanity must fight to.
That's right. I forgot about that.
So it immediately put it into context. In the Peter Jackson films, all that spectacle, you immediately know who to root for and who is the bad guy. The problem with Northern Wars is they would have benefited from some sort of title card, putting it in context, because it takes you several minutes to sort of sort out who's fighting whom and why they're fighting and who you should root for, if anybody. You know what I mean?
That is so true.
And that was one of my problems with that film.
Yeah, I think that they could have appended to the beginning of that film. They could have prefixed a statement like that, the Blade Runner intro, and not changed anything else, and it would completely transform how you consume that film. Isn't that interesting? Just a couple lines of context just make something up. And I think it just something to contextualize what we're about to experience. Just a couple lines is all it would have taken, and it would change that. That's really interesting how that works. I think it's right. I think you're totally right.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Yep.
Damien, what were your thoughts?
I have to say, I know even less about fantasy side of Warhammer.
Oh,
the
Damien.
Sci-fi. Well, we talked about some of the sci-fi Warhammer films, the Warhammer 40k films before, and we don't know who the sides are.
Star Wars of the Rings. Then you'd pay attention.
Yeah, that'll get my interest. No, but I mean, as far as I know, it's this. I think I said before, there are no good guys in Warhammer 40k, and I think that applies to the fantasy.
Yeah, somebody made that clear to us, didn't they?
Yeah. Very good point.
Yeah, that's all I know about the fantasy side of it. So I don't know. But here we've got two films. They're both sort of fantasy set films, both fights of different descriptions. And we've got Oryctes, which is a one-to-one, very personal fight. We don't have any backstory to it except for that little brief bit at the beginning of the text. But it's a very personal one-to-one fight, and you can get in really close. It's extremely well crafted using the Unreal Engine. They've obviously put a lot of work into animating it and doing all the the effects, and the sound was so good, all of that. And on the other side of it, you've got this huge sprawling battle made with this Warhammer game. And one of the things that struck me was you could not make each of those films in the other engine because they're not designed for that.
That's right.
You couldn't have a one-to-one personal fight in the Warhammer game because it's designed for huge armies, and you couldn't do a huge sprawling battle like that in Unreal because you need such an incredibly powerful machine to do it. And if you're going to animate each individual soldier or creature, that's a huge amount of work to do in a short video like this.
Good point. Good point.
And the other thing that struck me was that obviously the Warhammer game is a strategy game. We don't see much machinima made with strategy games. Not like this. I mean, obviously The Sims is a strategy game to an extent, but not a sort of war game strategy game. We don't see that very often. And I think that's actually a shame because games like this, they're designed for huge armies, or the space games with huge fleets of ships or whatever. And if you want to tell a story that has a big conflict, well, these are the kind of games that you need. Maybe you can mix it up with footage from another game to have the personal scenes to explain what this conflict is in your story. But then when you want to show the battle, switch over to something that is designed for that. And maybe you could do something along the lines of Lord of the Rings. But Phil, you were talking about that. These are Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films were sort of the first real instance of this being done. So it can be done with machinima. And I think this kind of shows that it's possible, these two different films. And you just got to figure out how you could put it together. But I think it can be done. I enjoyed both films. I didn't really need the backstory for either of those fights. I did find the Oryctes one a little bit more appealing because you could just fill in the gaps yourself of why this fight was happening. And whereas when it's just a generic sprawl of armies fighting each other, you need a little bit more context. I think this is what I think the rest of you said as well. So a little bit more would be there. Maybe people who are familiar with Warhammer, they already know exactly what's going on because it's part of the game lore that they know. But for those of us who don't know, just put a little bit in for us so we can grab it. But yeah, it's interesting to see how you can have two different fantasy fights in two different games on two different scales. I enjoyed both of them, but I don't really have anything else to say. But good picks.
The scale idea that you came up is just perfect.
Yeah,
and it reminded me of back in the heyday of machinima. You know how I would just go on these internet sprees to find interesting films, and I found a film that was made in Warhammer, and it was an opera, a Wagner opera. I think it was Götterdämmerung. And they used an old public domain recording, and they used Warhammer with this huge spectacle, because that's exactly what Wagner operas are. And it was just mind-blowing. It was full length. It was like an hour and a half. It was just mind-blowing. Too long to sustain your interest with not high-quality resolution and everything. But the idea was great. So I watched it. I saved it. And then several years ago, I remembered it, and I went back to try to find it, and it's lost. It's gone.
Oh,
that's a shame.
And I was thinking, the idea of spectacle, large spectacle, groups of characters, it works perfectly with fighting because that's the game side of it, but can also work well in large spectacle music. A symphony, an opera in particular would go because it's an elevated style, but we haven't really seen anything like that. You're right. people don't tend to do that anymore. They did it more in the early days of machinima, but not so much, at least to my knowledge. If any listener knows about movies that we're missing, please let us know. But I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
One other thing that I'll mention about Oryctes is if I have any criticism of it at all, I'm pretty sure I heard the same oof sound used at least twice and maybe even more than twice. So a little pro tip.
Yep.
If you're going to hire someone to do voice acting for a part, and that character is going to fight or fall or strain to lift something or any of those types of things, have them record way more of that content than you think you'll need. Like multiple. One is not enough, because one done well, and that's the only time you hear it, is great. But if you hear that same you're making your own little Wilhelm scream moment for the audience, where it becomes comical. That it's like, dude, that's the same sound he made just a minute ago, and it's a different fall. So that's the only, I had to really dig down deep to even remember that.
That is so petty, Phil.
Such a great crafted film. But
oof.
Yeah,
they didn't have a different oof. Good Lord.
Well,
my God.
Those are really great comments, and it's really interesting that you didn't see the same side of it as I was kind of trying to extract from the discussion. But really, really interesting comments.
Yeah.
About both of them. So thanks for that. Really great.
Sometimes I think the films we pick, even if we disagree with them, they produce discussions that help us understand the film more after being together and discussing it, as opposed to just writing down your own thoughts. And that's part of the reason why I like being on the show, is to be able to share those thoughts with you guys.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, there's definitely two interesting films you've chosen, Tracy. So
as always,
both of them. Yeah, and discussing it as well. Like you said, it's very interesting discussion of all different sides of these films. And I'm glad to, again, as I said last week, I'm glad to be part of it. So I think that wraps things up for this episode. So if you've got any feedback, if you want to talk about this film, if you want to send us your oof sound effects, if you want to tell us how we're pronouncing Oryctes, if we didn't get it wrong, please tell us, because we all had different ways of saying it. Please contact us at talk@completelymachinima.com. Check out our blog, also at completelymachinima.com, where you find more than the news and the show notes. And that's it. So thank you all for being here. Thanks. For listening. And happy holidays. See you next week.
Bye-bye.